Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner, co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum at the First Unitarian Universalist Church. Welcome. Our forums have been running continuously over 50 years, maybe even 60 years. Our forums are free and open to the public. They occur most Sundays at noon. And for more information on our forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Our mission is to nurture the mind and the spirit and serve social justice. Today, I am very happy and honored to announce our speaker, Kristin Houle, who is Executive Director of the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. And she's going to discuss rapid shifts in the death penalty landscape as executions and death sentences decline and the chorus of voices raising concerns about the criminal justice system continue to grow louder. The excessive costs of capital punishment, the inhumane nature of the death penalty, and the inadequacy of our system of legal defense for those without resources will all be explored. As you may know, especially in Texas, with the improvement of evidence with DNA and learning not to rely on eyewitness testimony, we have had many exonerations of people committing crimes. Let me tell you a little more about Kristin. She's been in her position as Executive Director since December 2008. She was a Soros Justice Fellow from 2007 to 8 when she conducted research and public education around the intersection of the death penalty and severe mental illness in Texas. She served for 5 years as the Program Associate for Amnesty International USA's program to abolish the death penalty. She was in Washington, D.C. then. She's been involved with a number of different human rights and anti-death penalty movements since 1995 and has held several volunteer leadership roles with Amnesty International USA prior to becoming employed by them. She worked in Kentucky and Illinois in anti-death penalty movements. And in 2012, she participated in the 2012 Rockwood Fellowship for Death Penalty Abolition Leaders. She's a graduate of the University of Kentucky and now lives in Austin. And she was a Unitarian attending All Souls Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C. So let's give Kristin a big, warm welcome. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today. It's wonderful to see so many friends and longtime supporters of the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty in the audience today. As Bonnie mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about the shifting death penalty landscape in Texas and hopefully persuade you that even in Texas, the death penalty's days are numbered. Before I get to the current landscape, though, I want to take you back about 16, 17 years to the turn of the century, 1999-2000. Those are really pivotal years in our movement for a couple of reasons. Back in 1999, there were 98 executions nationwide. That was the highest number of executions carried out since the death penalty was reinstated by the U.S. Supreme Court back in 1976. Texas accounted for about 35 of those executions. That was also the year that new death sentences peaked in Texas when juries sentenced 48 people to death in a single year. The following year, 2000, was when executions actually peaked in Texas, and our state put 40 people to death by lethal injection. Something else happened in 2000, though, something that really changed the conversation about the death penalty. In January of that year, Illinois Governor George Ryan, a Republican, a pharmacist by background, imposed a moratorium on executions in his state out of concern that too many innocent people were being sentenced to death in Illinois. The state had executed 13 people in the same time frame. They had exonerated 12 people from death row, and Governor Ryan thought something was amiss, something had gone awry, and that it was incumbent on him as the governor to put a pause on executions, and he subsequently appointed a Blue Ribbon Commission to look at problems with the death penalty, and many years later, the state actually abolished the death penalty. But in 2000, Governor Ryan's actions really elevated public awareness of the risks of wrongful convictions, particularly when it comes to the death penalty. And I feel like that really changed the conversation about this issue. I mean, certainly people had been talking about cases of wrongful conviction prior to that, but again, having a sitting Republican governor say, look, something's wrong here, we need to take a look at this, really changed the dynamics. Flash forward 15 years to 2015, the state of Texas went more than 9 months without a single death sentence being imposed anywhere in the state. The first death sentence of the year in 2015 didn't come until early October out of College Station, and the state ended with just 3 death sentences in 2015. It was a record low. 3 death sentences in the entire state of Texas. There were actually 4 other trials where juries were asked to consider imposition of the death penalty, and they rejected it. You know, again, just for context, 1999, 48 people sentenced to death in Texas. 2015, 3 people. So what happened in these intervening years? What got us to this place? There are a number of factors that account for this decline in use of the death penalty in Texas and nationwide. I should note that last year, actually, in the entire United States, I think 49 people were sentenced to death. So you can see that Texas is really mirroring national trends when it comes to declining use of the death penalty. There are several factors accounting for this. First and foremost is the availability of life in prison without the possibility of parole. That didn't become a sentencing option in Texas until 2005. Texas was actually the last state that has a death penalty to give juries that option in capital murder cases. And it really has given prosecutors a lot more discretion in terms of how they handle capital murder cases, and it's given juries options too. Again, we saw last year more juries voted against the death penalty than voted to impose it, now that they have what they consider a safe alternative to the death penalty. Some of the other factors accounting for the decline in death sentences are, as I mentioned, prosecutorial discretion, not only because they have life without parole, but also there's a growing recognition among prosecutors that the exorbitant cost of pursuing the death penalty, particularly at the trial level, just isn't worth it anymore. We see that increasingly so in our smaller rural counties. I've also seen improvements in the quality of legal counsel appointed to represent indigent defendants in capital murder cases. You know, it was not uncommon for judges to appoint grossly unqualified attorneys to represent those facing the ultimate punishment. Such that we even had attorneys that were falling asleep during their clients' trials, right? But back in 2001, the Texas legislature began to create standards for the appointment of counsel for those representing indigent defendants in capital murder cases. And again, this is part of the calculus that prosecutors take into account. Now knowing that they're going to face a worthy adversary in the courtroom, many are just opting not to pursue the death penalty in capital murder cases. The final factor that we believe accounts for the decline in use of the death penalty is, again, the awareness of wrongful convictions. We have now seen 156 people exonerated from death rows nationwide due to evidence of their wrongful conviction. That includes 13 people here in the state of Texas. Last summer, the Harris County District Attorney dismissed capital murder charges against Alfred Brown, who had spent a decade in prison. He was convicted of killing 2 people while robbing a check cashing business in Houston. One of those individuals killed was a police officer. Alfred Brown claims that he was in his girlfriend's apartment and that he placed a phone call to her from the apartment at the exact time that the murders took place. The problem was his attorneys weren't able to corroborate that during his trial. A couple years ago, though, a homicide detective in Houston was cleaning out his garage and going through boxes of evidence, and lo and behold, there is a written record establishing the phone call being made from the apartment at the exact time that Alfred Brown said it was. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals threw out his conviction in 2014 on the basis of this evidence, which had never been turned over to his attorneys, and the current district attorney determined that there was not enough evidence to support a conviction and that they couldn't go forward with another trial. So he spent 10 years in prison on death row for a crime that he did not commit. So these, again, are the main reasons for the decline in use of the death penalty in Texas. Some things aren't shifting, though, I will say, and those come down to the two greatest predictors of who gets sentenced to death in this state. Those are zip code and race. And zip code, by zip code I mean the geographic isolation of the death penalty. Death sentences have never been imposed uniformly across the state of Texas. Our state kind of unfairly gets painted with a broad brush when it comes to the death penalty, but in fact, more than half of our 254 counties have never sent anyone to death row. And it's really only been a handful of jurisdictions that account for the vast majority of death sentences. The number one offender in this regard is Harris County, which includes Houston. They've sentenced nearly 300 people to death just from that single county. And so what we see as use of the death penalty is declining, that it's becoming even more isolated to just those few jurisdictions that have historically accounted for its use, such that just 8 counties account for 60% of the new death sentences imposed in Texas over the last 5 years. I'm sad to say that does include Travis County, which I think comes as a surprise to some folks. So zip code, I think, really is one of the main predictors of who gets sentenced to death in this state. And I think that also really helps to undermine the idea that the death penalty serves as any kind of deterrent, right? I mean, if individuals who are intent on committing a crime were really thinking about the consequences of their behavior, no one would ever commit murder in Houston, right? They'd be like, oh, I'm just going to go over the border to Austin County because they don't ever sentence anyone to death there. But as we know, and as police chiefs know, people really are not weighing the consequences of their behavior, and they're not even thinking they're going to get caught, right? So geographic isolation and zip code really have a big role to play in death sentencing in this state, and that's not changing. The overall numbers are declining, right? So Harris County, and back in the 1990s, would sentence as many as 15 people to death in a single year. In the last few years, we've had some years where no death sentences have come out of Harris County, including last year, but still overall, they're the state leader in death sentences. Another thing that's not shifting is the racial bias with the death penalty, both in terms of the race of the victim. We see death penalty cases being brought much more often for murders involving white victims. And we also see death sentences being sought much more often when the defendants are people of color. About close to 60% of the death sentences imposed in Texas just in the last 5 years have been imposed on African American defendants. The population of Texas African American population of Texas is about 12%, but historically and currently African Americans comprise about 40% of our state's death row inmates. And these trends are even more pronounced, perhaps not surprisingly, in our high-use counties. So in Harris County, 15 of the last 18 people sentenced to death are African American. 15 out of the last 18 people sentenced to death are African American. The other 3 are Latino. The last time Harris County prosecutor and jury sentenced a white defendant to death was in 2004. These trends are also true in Dallas County, where 8 out of the last 11 defendants sentenced to death are African Americans. So racial bias, continues to play a very prominent role in use of the death penalty in Texas. I think it's really important, and I spend so much time talking about death sentences as the reflection of the current climate, because they really do reflect the current practices, current approach by prosecutors, and current public sentiment. And that's where we've really seen the progress and movement away from the death penalty in Texas. When it comes to executions, however, our state is still an outlier. Last year, the state of Texas accounted for 13 out of the 28 executions that happened in the United States. And since 1982, the state has put 533 people to death. And just to put that into context, Oklahoma is the next highest state on that list, and they've carried out 112 executions. So 533 and 112. It's vastly out disproportionate in Texas. But even on that measure, while Texas remains one of the nation's most active states in terms of executions, you have to remember that executions involve cases that occurred 15, 20, 25, sometimes even 30 years ago. So the death penalty practices that were taking place at that time are vastly different than the practices that we see today. So there's a real dichotomy between executions, reflective of cases in the past, and death sentences reflective of current practices. And even on that measure, executions are declining. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, back in 2000, the state of Texas put 40 people to death. Last year, that number was 13, and it's really hovered in the teens for the last few years. It's even more significant is the cases that were scheduled for execution but received stays of execution. Last year we had a record number of stays granted by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which granted stays in 8 cases, really suggesting just a greater scrutiny of these cases. So cases I think that would have just been given a green light by previous iterations of the Court of Criminal Appeals were actually stayed, including cases like Rodney Reed out of Bastrop County, where there's still DNA evidence that hasn't been tested, or cases involving other kinds of forensic science that has now been called into question, or cases involving, inadequate defenses. All of these things are really, I think, starting to seep more into the consciousness of the judges that we elect, such that they have been halted before we have a gross miscarriage of justice. Now, I think, again, the fact that we have had so few death sentences in this state in recent years suggests to me that we have what I consider a hierarchy of murder, and this idea that, the death penalty is supposedly reserved for the so-called worst of the worst, or it's supposed to be for the worst crimes. But I don't know how prosecutors can distinguish between really, what they call like a really terrible murder and then just like your average murder. I mean, I don't know what that means. We actually had a district attorney quoted as saying he would never seek the death penalty for your run-of-the-mill murders. I think that's probably one of the most offensive statements I've ever heard in my life. But think about this. We have hundreds of cases that are charged as capital murder in Texas each year, but the death penalty is being pursued in less than a dozen of them, and coming back with 10 or fewer death sentences a year. So how do you decide? I mean, is there really such a thing as a worst of the worst offender, or is one murder, is killing 3 people worse than killing 2 people, or, all of these sorts of things. Even the cases last year, the 3 cases where we had death sentences and the 4 cases where the jury rejected it, I mean, it was really just a crapshoot. There was no way to tell which of these cases was going to result in a death sentence. And the fact that we do have life in prison without the possibility of parole as an alternative, I think is giving greater confidence to prosecutors and to juries that we can protect the public and punish those who are truly guilty of committing heinous crimes without resorting to the death penalty. The people that we elect as district attorneys, as our district judges, county judge, and county commissioners all play key decision-making roles on this issue, much, much more actually than our state legislature. And that's either in terms of budgeting funds for these expensive capital murder trials, setting execution dates, or determining whether to pursue the death sentence in the first place. So it's really, really important in this elections year that we look at those down-ballot races, that we educate ourselves on the people who are going to be representing ourselves and who are going to be in charge of these criminal justice practices. And the fact that the ground under the death penalty is shifting hasn't been overlooked by those most intimately connected with the criminal justice system. In recent years, we've seen a number of elected officials, even in Texas, who are expressing concerns about the death penalty or outright opposition to it. Recently, Judge Tom Price, a Republican who served on the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals for, I believe, 20-some years, as he, in one of his final dissenting opinions, said that he thinks that the death penalty should be abolished, that in all of his years on the bench has led him to the conclusion that it's just not worth maintaining the system, that the risk of executing innocent people is just too high, and that we do have safe alternatives. We've also heard from Michelle Lyons, who was the public information officer for the Walls Unit in Huntsville, where executions take place. In that capacity, she had to liaise with all the journalists covering executions and witnessed more than 100 executions. Many of those haunt her to this day, and while she's not necessarily opposed to the death penalty, I think that, we see the sort of ripple effect that this practice has on so many people. Another person that we work with closely is Tim Cole, who served as the district attorney up in Montague and a few other North Texas counties. And he said that he never felt comfortable in his role as the person who gets to make a judgment of life and death. We give prosecutors absolute discretion in this regard. There's no oversight, there's no accountability, and he feels like no person should be allowed to have such power. So Texas has, as with many things, an outsized role to play in national efforts to end the death penalty. And our work here is extremely important because what happens in Texas has a ripple effect on things around the country. So we see in coverage of this issue again and again these words, even in Texas. Even in Texas, death sentences are declining. Or last year, even in Texas, no one has been sentenced to death for 9 months. Even in Texas, judges are staying executions to consider evidence of wrongful conviction. So we feel like, the measures of progress that we've seen here, again, have a tremendous effect and tremendous value on efforts around the country. And vice versa, the work that our colleagues do around the United States to abolish the death penalty has a tremendous effect here in Texas. We've seen now 7 states do away with the death penalty in the last 7 years, including Nebraska, which abolished the death penalty in 2015. We've seen, again, record low numbers of executions and death sentences around the country, and the fact that Texas is contributing to those trends is extremely important. So our focus as the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty is to continue to reduce use of the death penalty, both in terms of death sentences and stopping executions as we're able to, and doing what we're calling damaging the death penalty brand. So demonstrating the ways that all of the ways that the death penalty is a broken, ineffective, and expensive government system. So we work both on the state and county level. So when the legislature is in session, we are advocating for repeal of the death penalty as a way to engage in dialogue with elected officials about this practice. But even more so over the last few years, we've been focusing our efforts on the county level because that's where the change is occurring and that's where we see further opportunities. So we have a new staff member who's working up in Dallas and Tarrant counties to reduce use of the death penalty there by engaging with community leaders, with civic groups, faith leaders, and anyone else who's interested in this issue to try to raise the visibility, to engage in conversation, and to really persuade district attorneys in those counties that their voters, their constituents, don't want them to be pursuing the death penalty. We also engage in public education efforts throughout the state, speaking to faith communities, civic groups, what have you. We do a lot of strategic communications work to tell these important stories of people like Alfred Brown, also like our friend Anthony Graves, who spent nearly 18 years in prison, including 12 and a half years on death row, and faced 2 execution dates as an innocent man. we do a lot of work featuring Anthony and others, people that we consider voices of experience. So these are exonerees, surviving family members of murder victims who oppose the death penalty, former prosecutors, correction officials, anyone who's been intimately connected with the system. And we're doing a lot to raise the visibility, to make sure that people are aware of the shifts in the death penalty landscape, both the public and elected officials. Just 2 weeks, or I guess last 2 weeks ago, we were at the Capitol delivering copies of our year-end report to every legislative office. This issue really isn't on the radar of most of our elected officials. It's really up to us to put it there and to voice our concerns as constituents and on the death penalty. So, I think that I think we say this often, but this really couldn't be a more important time to get involved in this issue, truly see the light at the end of the tunnel, such that, hopefully we'll be looking for a new job pretty soon. But even more importantly, this is an outmoded practice. Its days are numbered, even in Texas. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Kristin. We have a question from Douglas Bauer.
Oh, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Last fall, when Pope Francis was talking to Congress, he started off by talking about the sanctity of life in all its forms, and the Republicans got up and started cheering, and then he immediately pivoted to the death penalty. My question to you is, are there any possible alliances that can be formed between the pro-life crowd and the anti-death penalty crowd? I mean, maybe a bit of a Faustian bargain, but I'll let you comment on that.
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, one of the other trends that we've seen in recent years has been this kind of growing number of conservative voices on the death penalty, either expressing opposition to it or at least concerns about its use. And many of the conservatives that we meet and talk to, and particularly outside of Texas, have very serious concerns about the death penalty because of their pro-life position and not being able to reconcile those two things. Fiscal concerns and just concerns about not trusting the government, right? So we've seen that in a lot of states, and in fact in Nebraska, which abolished the death penalty last year, it was really conservative Republicans leading the way on that effort. We are going to be hosting Senator Colby Coash, who is a pro-life Republican Catholic, who was one of the lead Republican sponsors of that legislation in Nebraska. So we're seeing these sort of alliances all over the country. And to some extent in Texas. I mean, we work very closely with the Texas Catholic Conference and the Catholic Church on this issue, and I think there are many people who do approach the death penalty from a pro-life perspective, what they would consider the seamless garment of life. We also had last year, for the first time, an abolition bill introduced in the Texas Senate by Senator Eddie Lucio, who describes himself as a pro-lifetime legislator. He is a staunch Catholic, and that really drives a lot of his public policy initiatives. So I do see a lot of opportunities in that regard.
I wanted to ask if those people convicted of murder and sentenced to life without parole, are they having any luck in getting exonerated?
I don't know specifics on that, but we have this week, the National Registry of Exonerations, which is out of, I believe, the University of Michigan, and which tracks exonerations nationwide, not just for death penalty cases, but for all serious crimes, said that last year we had a record number of exonerations. I think 149 people exonerated around the country. That includes people who have been sentenced to life in prison. So.
It may seem like a little trivial or even a little crass question, but what percentage of savings do you think we'd have if we had life imprisonment without parole? Is it possible that most executions cost more than that would?
Yes, the death penalty is much more expensive than life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's about 2 to 3 times more expensive. And that has been studied exhaustively in state after state, and they all kind of come up with the same overall number, that it's about 3 times more expensive. We would see particularly the savings at the county level. We have seen trials just recently that the first death sentence of the year in 2015 out of Brazos County cost Brazos County up about $2 million for just one trial. So we've seen in other places where they've spent huge sums of money on the death penalty, the county has then had to raise taxes or deny county employee raises. So it really does have a very real fiscal impact. We have a sheet that explains why the death penalty is so expensive and gives some really great examples from counties in Texas just outside for anyone who's interested.
My name's Joanne Richards. My question has to do with whether there's any statistics about the death penalty cases in states where merit selection for judges occurs versus electing judges.
Yeah, great question. Yes, there have been some investigations into that issue, and I believe it has shown that the practices are much more aggressive in states that elect their judges, especially when it comes to the death penalty. I don't know the exact, how it breaks down, but I know that research did conclude that that elected judges, there was a correlation between electing judges and aggressive use of the death penalty.
Yes, Hamilton Richards. Occasionally in discussing the death penalty with people, I run across someone who says that they want to reserve the death penalty for cases where the defendant's guilt is just not in doubt. Do you have any cases where a defendant whose guilt is absolutely indisputable has later been found to be innocent?
I mean, I guess it depends on your perspective, right? We've had prosecutors who think that they have, tried a slam dunk case and that all of the evidence pointed to that defendant. I'm having a hard time coming up with an example where it was irrefutable. I mean, to me, those questions are kind of frivolous because, that's not really the point. The point is, how do you decide? I mean, hundreds of people who are guilty of committing capital murder every year don't get the death penalty. So what makes one case more deserving than another? I think that, to me, is really the issue. I mean, certainly, I believe the vast majority of people on death row are guilty of committing heinous crimes. But, again, that's not the point. You can't maintain a system that can't get it right 100% of the time, which we can't.
Hi, Maria Fersen, and thanks for the work you're doing. We have a number of elections coming up here, for judges and also for district attorney. So how would I find out what people's stand on the death penalty is so it can help me in making my decisions in voting?
So since we're taping this, I have to say that TCADP is a 501c3 organization, which means that we cannot make any sort of endorsements or statements that could be construed as favoring one candidate or another. That said, I do know that there are some pretty stark differences in opinion on the death penalty among several of the Democratic candidates running for district attorney. So, I think it's really a matter of just going to the Statesman or looking through the Austin Chronicle. They will certainly take note of these things. If you look at Quorum Report, they have done some. One of their contributors has done some work looking at judicial elections in Texas. So they've broken out, the Texas Supreme Court and then the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which handles death penalty cases, and they have, provided a really good background information about each of the candidates running for the I think 3 positions that are open on the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals this year. So the information is out there, and I definitely encourage you to look for that and to go to candidate debates and forums and to ask these candidates about their position on the death penalty. I truly believe that a lot of district attorneys don't consider themselves accountable to the voters, and that they really need to be reminded that people are watching what they're doing and want them to change their practices.
So to pick up on your last point, so we have people running for district attorney, and in your experience, would it make any difference if folks like these good people here in the room wrote an email or letters to people running for district attorney to say to them, hey, you're never going to be 100% sure, so please, speak out about your stand on the death penalty. And writing to our local papers, would that make any difference to do that sort of thing? Or what can people here do that would help, particularly now when the elections are coming, are underway, to make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. I think making your position known to the candidates, again, going to places where you have an opportunity to meet them, to dialogue about these issues, so that they know that this is an issue of concern to the community, I think would be super helpful. I think we also need to be sure to praise and thank our elected officials when they do the right things as well, right? So when a prosecutor decides not to seek the death penalty in a capital murder case, I think that's something that needs to be recognized, acknowledged, and there are opportunities for that as well. But I think first and foremost, reminding these candidates that they are elected officials and that, Texas voters are not a monolith. I think a lot of elected officials, particularly in the legislature, looked at the death penalty as a status quo. Again, it's not an issue that is really on their radar. It's not something that they're paying attention to. So once they understand that it really has changed dramatically, is really helpful. But otherwise, they're just going to kind of consider, they're just going to take that position that a lot of political figures like to say, like, oh, this is Texas, and we have the death penalty, and we're super tough on crime, blah, blah, blah. I think that rhetoric is really changing, although it does pop up from time to time. But being front and center and reminding them that, we're voters and, we're watching.
Thank you very much. My question is this, and it's a very naive one because I don't know much about anything about this. But it seems to me that the death penalty can be seen as a punishment and as a deterrent. And I'm not sure what the connection might be between those two in an argument about getting rid of it.
So when it comes to deterrence, to me that's it's really an academic exercise. I think, even after we get rid of the death penalty, academics are going to argue as to whether it is or isn't a deterrent. And we've seen exhaustive studies claiming that it is, and we've seen exhaustive studies saying that it's not a deterrent. Such that the National Academy of Sciences a couple of years ago said, look, guys, it's just a wash. There's no conclusive evidence on either side, and so therefore public officials really shouldn't rely on any of these deterrence studies when they're making public policy decisions. I do believe there are people who believe that the death penalty is a just punishment for those who commit crimes involving murder, and those are individuals who believe that it is retribution. But again, I keep going back to this idea of but for who and how do you decide? Because you can't sentence everyone who commits murder to death. Our criminal justice system just couldn't support that. And the Supreme Court has said death is different, right? So we can't have blanket death sentences, but we sure can't have this arbitrary system that sort of cherry picks who's going to live and who's going to die either. So to me, the best solution is to get rid of the death penalty altogether.
Thank you. One of my previous jobs, I used to travel frequently to Europe, and most of your comments have been so far on a state or national level. Mm-hmm. Could you comment on kind of international norms for the death penalty and how you think it affects the relationship between the United States and other countries.
Sure. So the death penalty has been abolished in law or practice in some 140 nations. So really, it is really just a handful of countries that account for the majority of executions each year. Usually the countries are China, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, and the United States is always in that mix of the top 5 executing countries. And I think it really does harm our ability to provide criticism of other countries' human rights records, particularly in Europe, where the death penalty has been outlawed for decades now. There are some real concerns about the United States' continued use of the death penalty, and European parliamentarians, often weigh in on cases in the United States. And I think it is a real point of contention in our relationship. They just cannot understand how the United States, our land of liberty and freedom and democracy, continues to use such a outdated practice, one that so many people, so many countries, even countries where they have had such atrocities like Rwanda, South Africa, do not have the death penalty. The vast majority of South American countries do not have the death penalty. So I do think that it has been, really kind of a thorn in our relationships with many other countries. And again, it undermines our ability to criticize countries like China or like Iran on their human rights practices. It's I think, somewhat hypocritical.
We've all heard stories about classes being assigned projects to help with the Innocence Project. Brings me to a question, what can we do as individuals to help? I mean, are there programs where we can volunteer to help research or, do some of the grunt work where there are attorneys who are actively working on helping inmates?
Most of the Innocence projects that I know about are housed in law schools around the state, so I'm not really sure how just members of the general public could get involved in that. But there's also another nonprofit entity, the Innocence Project of Texas, that may have a role for folks to play. I haven't really been familiar with it. Most of our most of our work has been through these innocence projects and law school clinics. But certainly happy to help you look for that kind of opportunity.
Well, is it fair to say that the United States is the only industrialized country that still has the death penalty? You gave out a number that I didn't quite get, something like 740 or something. And then you said something which I still didn't get about the Middle East. Mm-hmm. So repeat those numbers, and I guess my main question is about, are we the only industrialized country with a democracy, so-called, that still has the death penalty? I want to take some notes. Thank you.
Okay. So what I said was about 140 countries have abolished the death penalty in law or practice. Mm-hmm. The United States and then Japan are considered the only industrialized Western nations that still maintain the death penalty. In terms of the sort of top, the highest executing nations each year, it's usually China, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, and the United States.
Thank you. There was a state in the USA that had to postpone executions because they couldn't obtain the drugs for death now that they outlawed hanging and electric chair. Mm-hmm. Is that a true statement?
Yes, and that's very much a contributing factor to the decline in executions in recent years. We see about a dozen states where executions are on hold because of concerns related specifically to the lethal injection process. So either There have been lawsuits filed by the individuals on death row that are holding things up, questioning the constitutionality of their particular drug protocol. We've had other states where they haven't been able to obtain the drugs. We're seeing that in Virginia right now, and some other places where there's just been legal chaos created by issues related to lethal injection. In Texas, now executions are being carried out through a single dose of compounded pentobarbital, which is made by a compounding pharmacist, but we don't know who. This is now a state secret. The legislature passed a law last year that conceals the identity of any persons or entities that are manufacturing, producing, testing, transporting, even thinking about lethal injection. So that's really a problem, and this issue has been challenged. Not the secrecy issue, but the issue of the constitutionality of specific lethal injection protocols was challenged before the U.S. Supreme Court last year, and it's really kind of creating legal havoc around the country, and we're going to continue to see that issue play out in state after state.
This discussion has been going on since the late 1850s and into the 1860s, and there was an important person named Ingersoll, Robert Greene Ingersoll, who discussed this. He was a colonel in Lincoln's Union Army, and he was the Attorney General of Illinois, and he discussed this a lot about preventing capital punishment. And he said that capital punishment hardens and degrades a society, a community. And he also said that capital punishment does not prevent murder. It is encouraged by the state and is carried out by the citizens of the state. The state murders its enemies, and the citizen murders his. I'd like for you to comment about anybody. Have you ever heard of Robert Greene Ingersoll, or read any of his comments about capital punishment? They're current today.
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, thank you. No, I'm not familiar with him particularly, but yes, I absolutely agree with the sentiment that the death penalty has a brutalizing effect on our society, and it perpetuates the cycle of violence.
You mentioned that Travis County has had death penalty cases, and I was wondering when the last case had come before the court.
The last death penalty imposed in Travis County was in the case of Brandon Daniels, a young man who killed a police officer, I think it's Hemi Padron, in Walmart in 2013, I believe, was when the crime happened. So that was the most recent one.
I wanted to follow up a little bit. You mentioned the courts a few minutes ago. Of course, in the U.S. Constitution, there's a clause against no cruel and unusual punishment. Do you believe there's any chance of the U.S. Supreme Court overruling the death penalty as an option in the coming years?
Yes, that's a great question. So what we've seen in the court over the last decade is increasingly limiting the categories of offenders who are eligible for the death penalty under the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. What they said is that in the case of juvenile offenders, for example, those under age 18 at the time of the crime, and also for individuals with intellectual disabilities, the death penalty offends the evolving standards of decency of a maturing society. And in those decisions, the decision on juveniles came in 2005, the decision on individuals with mental retardation or intellectual disabilities in 2002, the court looked at this kind of cumulative body of evidence. What was going on in state legislatures? What was the practice? Like, who was being executed, who had provided evidence of their intellectual disabilities? How often were people being sentenced to death who could provide that evidence? They also looked at international practice and international law for guidance, and all of this was produced decisions in both of those cases that the death penalty was for those categories of offenders was unconstitutional. What we're seeing now, and particularly in light of last year's dissent by Justice Breyer in the case involving this question about a particular lethal injection protocol out of Oklahoma, Justice Breyer issued a very sharply worded dissent in which he said, I'm not going to be as eloquent as him, but he basically said, like, all of these questions are kind of irrelevant. What we should really be is really time for this court to be addressing the constitutionality of the death penalty. So what you're going to see is more and more attorneys who are fighting to stop the executions of their clients, continue to present sort of legal technical issues which they've always had to advocate for, but also questioning and challenging the death penalty's constitutionality under the Eighth Amendment. So even, we also had, so not just Justice Breyer, but there was a judge in California last year or the year before who also, in his ruling, said that the death penalty is unconstitutional, particularly in a state like California where you have 740-some people on death row and they've carried out 13 executions. So this idea that you're warehousing people on death row, but it's really a meaningless punishment there and it's especially meaningless when there's 30 years have lapsed between the time of the crime and an execution. Like, what are you really achieving? That ruling ultimately wasn't upheld, but again, you're kind of seeing this momentum of really questioning the constitutionality of the death penalty. And in Breyer's dissent last year, he pointed specifically to the decline in death sentences in Texas as a really important marker. And he looked at, again, this body of evidence, like what's going on around the states, what's happening in state legislatures, what's the practice, where are we seeing death sentences. I mean, the things that I've been talking to y'all about today in terms of the limited use of the death penalty in just a few counties, that's true all over the country. Our colleagues at the Death Penalty Information Center did a report a couple years ago called the 2% death penalty, and what it showed is that the vast majority of executions and death sentences nationwide come from just about 2% of all U.S. counties. And again, we see that reflected in Texas. So I believe, what we're doing now and the contributions that we're making on this issue in Texas by keeping death sentences low, stopping executions as we can is going to contribute to that ultimate Eighth Amendment challenge.
So you mentioned the person, Daniel, who was, I guess, convicted of murder here in Travis County. Mm-hmm. And I felt at the time that was really overlaid with potential drug abuse and mental illness. So do you see any changes coming nationally or in Texas dealing with people that commit murder when they also could be mentally ill or abusing drugs at the time of the crime? Are there any changes in punishment for those people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really been kind of an emerging issue in our field, is looking at trying to create exemptions for individuals with severe and persistent mental illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and sort of following the court's logic in outlining the death penalty for individuals with intellectual disabilities. I mean, it makes no sense to hold somebody who's in the throes of, schizophrenia to a higher standard than someone with intellectual disabilities and many of the same issues. So there are a handful of states where legislatures are considering this issue. Currently in Ohio, it's being considered at the committee level, and there are a couple other states this year and next year that are going to be introducing this legislation. And I think we see this sort of as part of the broader national dialogue about the impact of, or the intersection of individuals with mental illness and the criminal justice system. I mean, it's not just with the death penalty. I think there is a increasing national conversation about just the inappropriateness of incarceration for individuals with severe mental illness, the fact that our county jails have become the new kind of mental health hospitals. All these sorts of factors, I think, are contributing to that. And we have a number of cases in Texas of individuals on death row who were sentenced despite longstanding evidence of their mental illness. Scott Panetti has been on death row since the mid-1990s. He had been in and out of hospitals for about 14 years before the crime that of which he was convicted. And he believes firmly that the state of Texas seeks his execution to prevent him from preaching the gospel in prison. And, there have been many challenges on that, whether he's actually competent for execution. But the fact is, Scott Panetti never should have been sentenced to death in the first place. He was actually allowed to represent himself at his trial, during which he wore a purple cowboy costume and subpoenaed JFK, Anne Bancroft, and Jesus Christ, and the judge just let this happen. So there are all kinds of issues, and we would like to think like, oh, okay, well that was in 1995. Like surely things are better, right? Well, last year, one of the other individuals sentenced to death, James Calvert, out of Smith County, also was allowed to represent himself. His behavior was so disruptive. There were times that he had to be physically carried into the courtroom. He, would just go on these nonsensical tangents in his questioning of witnesses. Finally, the judge put a stop to it, but, he actually was placed in shackles and at one point tased by the law enforcement officials sitting with him because he was not complying with the judge's order. So these issues are still very much present in our criminal justice system and death penalty specific.
Question in.
Summarize for us, would you, the ethical issues, the core of the ethical issues that brings you to the position where you say that the death penalty is a very bad practice?
Well, I began working on the death penalty in 1995 when I first got involved with Amnesty International, and it really struck me that the death penalty was the ultimate violation of the right to life, of the of the ultimate violation of human rights. And I just, at my core, don't believe that our government has the right to make decisions of life and death about its own citizens.
Kristin, thank you so much. This is such a serious issue, and we appreciate your work. And maybe you can stay for a few minutes and meet with members of our forum if you have the time. Let's give her a big hand.